Today, the Supreme Court will hear arguments on President Trump's sweeping tariff policies. Justices will decide whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act really gives the president the authority to impose steep levies on countries around the world. Yesterday, Mr. Trump called this case, quote, life or death for our country, saying that without tariffs, the U.S. is, quote, virtually defenseless. CBS News legal contributor Rebecca Roiphe joins us now to explain how this might hit all of us. Good morning, Rebecca. You know, the president, as he frames his tariffs, he says it's about protecting America's economy. But explain the arguments against how the president implemented his tariffs.
Good morning, Errol. It's nice to see you. Yes, so the question is about that act that you mentioned and whether or not it authorizes tariffs, because taxes and levies are normally something that is left for Congress to decide. And so this act suggests that if the president declares certain kinds of emergencies, which it calls an unusual and extraordinary threat, then the president is allowed to investigate, prohibit, or regulate certain imports. And the question is whether or not that language, first of all, whether or not a trade deficit counts as an emergency, an unusual and extraordinary threat. And then the second question is, if it does that statute, which has historically been used to freeze certain terrorist assets or to prevent certain kinds of transactions with known dangerous groups, whether that, which has never been used to broadly regulate the imports like tariffs, could authorize those tariffs. Now, some of his language is, of course, overblown, because if he's not able to do this under this act, then Congress can, of course, step in and authorize the tariffs itself.
That's a very good point. So let's take the scenario the other way. If the court rules that a deficit does not count as a threat, they rule against Trump. What happens then? Would the administration have to refund tariff revenues? What impact could that have on business?
Yes, I mean, it could have a very serious impact. There would certainly, at least immediately, those tariffs would become unenforceable, or he would have to take them back. And then Congress could step in to reauthorize these tariffs or to authorize different tariffs if it chose to do so, but it would have to do so explicitly through a statute.
All right, Rebecca Roiphe with more on this really interesting case. We'll watch it closely. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
During today's argument, conservative Justice Brett Kavanaugh asked these questions. Listen.
The Constitution is structured so that if I'm going to be asked to pay for something as a citizen, that it's through a bill that is generated through Congress, and the president has the power to veto it or not. But I'm not going to be taxed unless both houses, the executive and the legislature, have made that choice, correct?
That's exactly right.
So there is something, it's not just the taxing power, qua taxing power. The question is, do we permit the president to use the taxing power to affect his personal choices?
All right, so that's the question and answer inside court while that hearing played out. But after it played out, attorneys for the plaintiff stepped before a mic and had this to say. We wanted to get that on.
Thank you. My name is Neil Katyal. I argued on behalf of the private parties, the small businesses in this case at the Supreme Court. I want to begin by thanking the Liberty Justice Center, and in particular its director, Sarah Albrecht, for the brilliant brains behind the operation. They were integral to everything you saw in the argument today. And we appreciated very much the chance to present our case to the Supreme Court. The justices asked tough questions, but fair questions, and very thoughtful ones. Our message today is simple. The Constitution, our framers, 238 years of American history, all say only Congress has the power to impose tariffs on the American people. And tariffs are nothing but taxes on the American people, paid by Americans. This case is not about the president, it's about the presidency. It's not about partisanship, it's about principle. And above all, it's about upholding the majestic separation of powers laced into our Constitution that is the foundation for our government. We thank the justices today for their extensive questioning in this case, and we look forward to the resolution.
All right, so let's break this down with one of my favorites, CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford inside to hear those questions. Okay, Jan, it's always fun to read the tea leaves, but any indication from your expertise, and you have a lot of it, of how those justices are leaning?
Well, you know, Reed, I just got out of almost 3 hours of that argument inside the courtroom. And I got to say, when these arguments started, it was a blue wall. The liberals all united, as you heard in that exchange from Justice Sonia Sotomayor, suggesting that the president simply didn't have this power under this 1977 federal law. So they were all together. And then you had some of the conservatives starting to jump in and really question whether President Trump could authorize these tariffs over, as you said, almost every U.S. trading partner, power that no president really has ever tried to do. But then, Reed, this is what you got to say for the whole thing, because as that argument progressed, you started to hear some of the conservatives kind of really beginning to suggest that the law actually may allow this kind of power. And if not this law, then there's another law that Trump could use to impose some of these tariffs. So do I have a clear sign of which way the justices are going to go in this case, Reed? No, absolutely not. And I think that anybody that can predict that with any amount of confidence, they're just kidding themselves, or it's wishful thinking. Right now, it is, I think, almost impossible to say because of that divide that we started to see at the end of the argument. And one justice, one conservative did appear pretty clearly with the liberals united against President Trump, and that was Justice Gorsuch. But the others were very difficult to read. And obviously, Reed, you've got to have 5 justices to carry the day in the Supreme Court.
Well, what we do know is that President Trump has been beating this drum about how he feels the United States is cheated by foreign nations. He's been talking about this since the 1980s. That is for sure. That agenda is set. But what we're starting to see is really the question of whether Congress has ceded too much power to the executive branch, right?
And that was Justice Gorsuch's big concern at the end, that Congress, really this is a power of Congress, this is a taxing power, and that it's only Congress that can impose these taxes. That was something that was so critical to the founders of this country. There wasn't a Boston tariff party. It was the taxing power that people were so concerned about, and that these tariffs essentially amount to a tax on the American people. But then there were other arguments, and I thought that the Trump administration did a really good job kind of saying, this is not a tax. This is a regulatory tariff. In fact, these tariffs work the best when no revenue is collected at all, because the point of them is to try to get these trading partners or get other countries like China to do deals with us. That the president is not imposing these tariffs to raise money. He's trying to strike deals. I thought that was a very good argument for the Trump administration at the very end of today's arguments. And Reed, it's also important to remember that this isn't all the tariffs. Even if Trump loses this case, the Trump administration has other tariffs that will remain in place for different reasons, using different laws. And those are hugely important tariffs that go to products like steel, lumber, aluminum, cars, trucks, all automobiles, et cetera, et cetera. Those tariffs will remain in place no matter what the court does in this case.
Well, and as we see the scaffolding on the building behind you, we're going to scaffold off of what you had to say about the strength of Team Trump and their attorneys' arguments. We had a moment ago the opportunity to hear from them. Stay with me. Let's go ahead and roll that, and then I want to ask you about it, Jan.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jan Crawford, Attorney General for the state of Oregon. We're proud to bring this case today. I think there was something that was incredibly important that was said today, and it wasn't said by any of our attorneys. It was said by President Donald Trump's Solicitor General when he looked Justice Roberts squarely in the eyes and said the American people, not foreign countries, but the American people are going to pay 30 to 80% of these tariffs, and then had the gall to look all of those justices again in the eye and say that these are not taxes on the American people. And they're doing it by abusing an emergency power. And I think that was the conversation that we heard today. Very proud of our attorneys and proud to have these amazing partners in A.G. Mays and A.G. Bonta along in this incredibly important fight when America's facing an affordability crisis.
Thank you, A.G. Roiphe. I'm Chris Mays. I'm the Attorney General of Arizona, and I would just echo those comments. This was, we feel really good about the arguments today. and the questions that were asked by the justices. But, you know, we brought this case, and this case is so important, maybe the most important case that this court has heard in 100 years, especially to our economy and to consumers and to businesses large and small. And that's why we brought this case, because number one, these tariffs are illegal. They were not predicated in the law or the Constitution, but most importantly, they are impacting the people of our states. We have small businesses in Arizona that are going out of business every day. I've talked to a furniture manufacturer, a restaurateur, a hotel owner, cattle ranchers along the southern border of Arizona, all of whom are struggling because of these tariffs and because they're raising prices on the people of this country. And so we needed to come here and we need to win this case. And that's why we're here. We appreciate the opportunity to make these arguments. And I'll turn it over to my colleague, Rob Bonta.
Thank you, everyone. Rob Bonta, California Attorney General, and grateful to be here with my colleagues on behalf of the states that have brought suit to support the American people who deserve better, who deserve to not have costs raised, who deserve to not be the victims of unlawful tariffs. Tariffs are taxes. Congress has the power to impose taxes. The president does not. He has used tariffs in a sweeping manner to impose 10 to 145% taxes on nearly every one of our trade partners, and workers are suffering, businesses are suffering, families across the country are suffering because of his unlawful conduct. And California is the fourth largest economy in the world, the biggest state in the nation. We are the largest importer of any state, the second largest exporter, the largest exporter of ag. We're the biggest manufacturer. We have an outsized economy, so these tariffs have an outsized impact on the people of our state and on our state. So I thought the argument surfaced all the key issues, and we are hopeful for a decision. We won't predict or speculate about what might happen, but I thought it was a great argument, and we hope that when the decision is made by the Supreme Court, we will be able to deliver the relief that Americans deserve, to have their costs lowered and not have a president who acts brazenly and blatantly in lawless manners, as he has done with the violation of the law here, when he has no statutory authority to impose these taxes. And we're happy to answer your questions.
All right. My apologies, Jan Crawford. We thought we were going to hear from President Trump's attorneys, but you're a sports fan, and I know you catch the ball that you're thrown, so let's talk about that. It's right. Especially striking to me, Jan. I pay attention to your Instagram. I know you're a sports fan. It is striking to me, though, that you are hearing from Rob Bonta of the state of California. He is having to answer to those people who have shipping business in the Port of Oakland, also down in Southern California. How much did the impact on businesses shape some of the arguments you heard in court today, or is that something we're going to get to in the days ahead?
So we didn't really get into the policy questions. The justices very much focused on the intricacies of this 1977 law that they claim, the administration claims, gives presidents the authority to regulate imports during national emergencies. And so that's why they're arguing Trump has this kind of power to impose tariffs. That's all they were focusing on, whether that's legal under the statute or legal in terms of the Constitution, not the policy questions. But Reed, in getting ready for this, we always have to do stories in advance, and we interviewed people on both sides, businesses on both sides. An importer of wines went to his warehouse in New Jersey, where he said that these tariffs are absolutely crippling small businesses because they have to pay them. If they're going to import a case of Chianti, the importers, the American importers, are the ones who are paying up front those taxes, and they're hoping that they're going to be able to sell that bottle of wine at a more expensive price. But then on the other side, we talked to the head of a cooperative of wine grape growers in California, and they say that this tariff, the system of tariffs that the president has imposed, will actually save or help save their businesses because European wines are so heavily subsidized by those foreign governments that American growers find it very difficult to compete. We got a hurricane here. So you see those both sides coming into play. and that's kind of who we spoke with in advance of this argument. But no one got into really some of those policy questions about the impact that it's going to have on businesses in the Supreme Court. One thing we did hear, though, Reed, that is the impact, is that what happens if Trump actually loses this case to the people who have already paid all those tariffs? We're upwards of $100 billion now that has been collected in tariffs since the president imposed these in the spring. Or is that going to all have to be refunded? And so, as Justice Barrett said, is this going to just be a complete mess? And so there is some concern, I think, among the justices about just the logistics of how that will happen. I don't think the court necessarily will get to that in its opinion, but it's something to look out for. Reed.
All right, Jan Crawford, never late to camera, but you are late for lunch, and you are excused. Get out from under that umbrella and go have something good to eat. Thank you so much, friend.
It's a little windy here today. All that hot air blowing around in Washington.
I'm going to have to call you a meteorologist probably pretty soon. Jan Crawford with your politics and your weather report. Thank you so much. Live with Scott Fredericksen. He's a former federal prosecutor. Scott, some people are kind of skeptical about how those conservative justices will lean. As you look at some of the arguments, knowing that questions often reveal us in this world, what are your thoughts about which way they're leaning?
Well, it seemed today that the Supreme Court evidenced the first time it really showed its skepticism for a major policy that President Trump has implemented, imposing tariffs on over 100 countries across the board. The questioning by conservative justices seemed to indicate a high degree of skepticism about whether the president has the power to do what he did and what no other president had ever done under this statute in question.
Well, and we know Mr. Trump's attorneys argued to the court that tariffs are not taxes. That's important because it really does cut Congress from the equation. They said that tariffs are regulatory, and that means that Congress definitely doesn't need to cede power to the president because that power lands in the president's office at the executive branch. How persuasive is that argument?
Well, we won't know until we see an opinion, of course, but if you listen to the arguments today, I think the betting is that the Trump administration did not persuade the court of its position. Indeed, the questioning seemed to indicate that the Supreme Court was more concerned about the delegation of such a broad sweeping power to the president when the statute does not explicitly allow the president to impose tariffs. So they're concerned about what they call the non-delegation power. In other words, the Congress can't just delegate away the power of taxation. In this case, the Constitution embeds with the legislative branch. And there were other concerns as well. The nature of this emergency that allowed the president to impose tariffs in a variety of situations that don't seem like emergencies to the justices. So there's a whole host of concerns, and maybe not a complete surprise, but it is the conservative justices who seem to show just as much skepticism as the liberal justices.
Scott Fredericksen, thank you so much for that conversation.
We return now to our top story. The Supreme Court heard arguments today on the legality of President Trump's sweeping tariffs on foreign imports. President Trump has cited 1977's International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which gives him broad control over the country's finances during a national emergency. But justices from both sides of the ideological spectrum were skeptical of the president's authority to issue tariffs without input from Congress. Yesterday, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt suggested there's a backup plan.
The White House is always preparing for Plan B. It would be imprudent of the president's advisors not to prepare for such a situation. With that said, we are 100% confident in the president and his team's legal arguments in the merits of the law in this case.
CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson joins me now. So, Jessica, what is the key legal question in this case, and what stood out to you from today's arguments?
The key legal question is whether or not the president has the power to unilaterally impose tariffs under this 1977 law, the IEEPA, even though it doesn't use the word tariff and it's never been previously used to impose tariffs. What stood out today is, I think, exactly what you said in the intro, which is that I saw skepticism across the aisle in this case, or across the ideological spectrum. I think what we saw is the three liberal justices be pretty united in their skepticism of whether or not President Trump or any other president has the power to look at the statute, say there's a national emergency, and then try and impose these sweeping tariffs. I think what you also saw is some of the justices on the more conservative end of the spectrum trying to figure out, if you allowed the Trump administration to do this, where would the limiting principle be? Because, of course, this is Congress's power to give. Back all the way back to the Constitution. The Constitution says it's Congress that has the power to impose taxes and tariffs and regulate foreign commerce. So the question is, did Congress give enough of direction to the president to say, this is what you can do with respect to this particular statute?
So we heard Caroline Levitt talk about Plan B. If the justices say, look, President Trump can't impose this using this law, what options does the White House have to issue tariffs?
So two big options. One, look to another law. There are other laws that use the word tariff. There are other laws that have been previously used to impose tariffs. The other is to try and go to Congress once they get back in session and say, give me more authority, give me clearer authority, delegate authority to me, the president, in this situation to impose tariffs.
Jessica Levinson, thank you.
Thank you.